En við erum alveg virkilega ánægð með það að vera komið með CDP í heimsókn til okkar. En þetta er alþjóðleg umhverfis samtök sem við höfum verið að starfa með síðan 2016 og erum mjög stolt af því að vera í dag á A-lista samtakana. Það er gaman að segja frá því að Halldór Þorgeirsson sem er hér með okkur í dag, hann var einmitt einn af hvatamönnum þess að við fórum að skila inn til þeirra á sínum tíma og erum við honum hjartanlega þakklátt fyrir það núna að þegar árangurinn hefur svo sannarlega komið í ljós. En ráðstefnan er í dag á ensku og því ætla ég að skipta yfir fyrir gestin okkar. Now that we've switched over to English, I want to start by welcoming our guests from CDP here to Iceland, and I really much look forward to spending the afternoon with you here today. It's a great opportunity for us here in Iceland to learn from your extensive experience in gathering information and providing valuable feedback to organizations to improve their integration of climate-related risks and opportunities for better business decisions. We believe that you are without a doubt a leading party in helping companies and others finding the way through what I believe sometimes can be a bit confusing world of measuring, managing, and disclosing environmental information. And by doing that, you're paving the way towards a more sustainable economy. We at Landsvirkjun, we are an energy company owned by the people of Iceland, and we generate electricity from renewable resources, hydro, geothermal, and wind. We are working with natural resources directly, and we see the effects of climate change in our operations through our monitoring and research programs. We have a clear vision and are very focused in our actions to reduce our impacts, support Icelandic commitment towards the Paris Agreement, and responding to climate change-induced challenges and opportunities. But why is disclosure so important? Well, firstly, you can't manage what you can't measure. And also, if you're not sure where you are standing today, it's difficult to change course and find a new and more improved way forward. It has been our experience that being a member and disclosing data to CDP provides guidance on best practice and can ensure that climate change is effectively managed throughout operations, throughout the whole organization and our value chain. If we are together to overcome today's climate challenges, we cannot keep doing business as usual. We need to transform the norm. We are in a hurry, I think we all agree on that, but we need to be focused, work together, and rely on those who are leading the way towards best practice and give trustworthy signals of our performance that will help everyone make more responsible decisions. And there I'm thinking about governments, companies, organizations, cities, etc. And of course, in the end, the consumer. The challenge is huge, but if we all work together and put a clear focus on the task ahead, I believe the task will be more achievable. My colleague Jóhanna will give you a better insight into how CDP has assisted us on our journey. I hope you will be as inspired here today as we have been working with CDP towards their vision for a more sustainable economy. Today, they will take the stage, and I encourage you to participate in the discussion, both here in the room, but also in the coffee breaks. Don't hesitate to jump towards them and have a good conversation and make connections. So, Max, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Jóna. It's great to be here in Iceland, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a special privilege, an opportunity to be here in Reykjavik with you. For CDP's first event in Iceland, so this is a monumentous moment for all of us. But many thanks to you, Jóna, and your team at Landsvirkjun, and congratulations again for your success and the leadership that you're showing as a true partner in Iceland to drive a sustainable economy that works for both people and planet. We appreciate the dedication that you've offered to us to help have this event today so we can start a very important conversation with all of you here in Iceland about economic-wide transparency, climate action, and nature positivity. But as Jóna said, I am Maxfield Weiss, and I lead CDP's work across Europe to drive action towards a net zero and nature positive economy. And that's what we're here to talk about, net zero and nature positivity. But as a nonprofit that runs the world's environmental disclosure system, and we've done so for 20 years, that means that we have a 20-year track record of how corporations, as well as cities, states, and regions, are acting on issues of climate change and nature positivity. And we have such, at CDP, a long and rich history with businesses, as well as investors, cities, and policymakers across the Nordics, because that's what we're here to talk about today, that economic-wide integration. But I must point out, and I think this is an important point to make, that although we're excited about the progress like companies that Landsvirkjun is making, or the city of Reykjavik, that the task ahead of us is something that is stark and massive. And as the IPCC report says, it is now code red for humanity. It's code red for humanity. And I think this is something that we don't take stock of enough, because climate impacts, they're here. There's something that we are feeling on a day-to-day basis. There's something that are affecting the cities that we live in. There's something that's affecting the businesses and how they operate. And these impacts, they're worsening. We have very little room to maneuver. We're actually, I would say, at a point of no return. And I'm sure that it's not necessary to point out to all of you that temperatures are rising, especially here in the Arctic, faster than anywhere else on Earth. And Iceland, I think this is something that's quite stark to say. It may not be the land of ice in the future. Almost all glaciers are melting. Marine ecosystems, which your economy relies upon, and fisheries, they're extremely threatened. And it's happening. It's here. It's living with us today. And we're frankly nowhere close to CDP achieving its mission. And as an NGO, to say that you are nowhere close to achieving your mission is something that's quite humble and stark to say. So, of a global economy that works for people and planet, that's what we're trying to do as CDP. We're trying to exist equitably within our planet's limits. And that should be the goal of every single company, every single city, every single investor, and every single country around the world from an integrated perspective. Because we have to prevent, we have no choice, but we must prevent catastrophic impacts of a warming world. That is what is upon us. It's what is demanded by us, and it's what our future generations will expect of us. And that's why we need to see environmental transparency in action from across the economy. And what I mean is by major leanings and learnings from banks, from cities, from companies, from investors, and of course, public authorities, because they all have mutual dependencies and how they interact together as an economy. And this interaction is what is extremely important to be able to see the other end of our environmental crisis. For companies, think about it, their supply chain impacts from their customers make about 90% of their total impacts on average. It's not really about what's happening within your company's own four walls. That is not where your mere responsibility lies. It is driven up and down the value chain that you operate within. From an investor perspective, investors, they need to see their clients and portfolios to change before they can hit their own goals. This is about systemic thinking of change and how we drive a transition to the new economy that we all need to thrive within. And cities, not only are they the place that we live and enjoy our lives and livelihoods with our families, they are the source of 70% of global emissions. And they need to collaborate with finance to see and achieve their own climate plans. So whichever way we look at it, We rely on each other. We all rely on the interrelated dependencies of our economic system to create a 1.5-degree world and an environmentally secure economy, because that's what this is about. It is about creating an economy that is secure and prosperous for us to thrive, not to pull it backward, but to drive it forward into a future that transitions and works for people and planet in an equitable way. And that's particularly the case in a unique country like Iceland, which I'm so excited to be here with all of you today. You see, CDP, we've seen this work in countries like Italy and Portugal and France, where governments are actually taking a leading voice, working with the cities as well as the corporations and public authorities to really drive a framework for transparency, with governments being a partner to these non-state actors, which are very integral to be able to show what the art of the possible is. And most major companies and cities are now disclosing within these countries that have endorsed CDP from a disclosure perspective. They're setting ambitious targets. After you disclose, you need to set your targets, you need to lay out what your plans are and how to achieve them. And this action from governments can spur economic output and activity from that humble beginning of transparency. That is the plan that we must make. And I'd love to see, and this is my challenge for all of you today. This is exactly why CDP here. Our challenge for Iceland is that in 2023 or 2024, Iceland will be the first country in Europe and perhaps around the world to integrate economic transparency, working across governments, municipalities, as well as companies and public authorities to create an economy that is based on transparency. And that simple aspect of an environmental transparency has an opportunity to spur business, to open up your doors to economic innovation and to an economy that has realized the transition, and to show to investors and communities and other aspects of the global economy what is possible from an environmental and social governance perspective with the bedrock of transparency. But to accelerate action and to align the entire economy and society where it's not already, we're going to need to drive a resilient and nature-positive economy. And that's what CDP hopes to partner with all of you starting today, because this is our decade of decisive environmental action. We need essentially a portal between our world and what is to come next, from a change in business behavior and business models. This is the portal we need. We need the people in this room, the cities, the public authorities, the companies, the investors, the capital markets, and the government to work in one cohesive voice, because you will be the ones that essentially drive this transition for Iceland and for itself as your country, and to show what is impossible and inspire and send a beacon of innovation and transparency from the Arctic to inspire what economic ecosystem transparency could look like and what the art of the possible is to the rest of the world. So that's what I hope to have with this conversation with you today. I hope that you are inspired by this challenge. So let's drive an important conversation about how we can continue to achieve environmental action, net zero, and nature positivity today in this room as partners together in an aim for transparency as the bedrock of action. Thank you so much. I look forward to the fruitful conversations that we have today, and we're very inspired to be here on invitation of Landsvirkjun. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Jóhanna from Landsvirkjun to continue the conversation. Thank you so much, Jóhanna. Thank you.
Góðan daginn, gaman að vera með ykkur. So, let's skipta yfir á ensku. Thank you, Max. So inspiring, as always, to listen to you talk. And I look really forward to today. The energy sector is responsible for the main bulk of emissions globally. And as a humankind, we definitely need to eliminate fossil fuel and move to a more renewable-based and circular economy. As a 100% renewable energy company, with one of the lowest carbon intensity generated globally, and as a company owned by the people of Iceland, a nation that has committed to ambitious target in reducing carbon emissions
to become carbon neutral in 2040 and fossil fuel free by the same year, we, Landsvirkjun, are committed to do our part. Our commitment to climate action and environmental management is, however, nothing new. Forgetting this. Somebody else was too forgetting this, it seems like. Here we go. Yeah, our vision. And we have a clear vision at Landsvirkjun for a sustainable world powered by renewable energy. And I think it goes very hand in hand with the core of what we do and our commitments to environmental management and climate action. But as I said, it's nothing new. We are a company utilizing natural resources, renewable natural resources, and operating in Icelandic, often unspoiled nature. Founded in 1965, Landsvirkjun has decades of experience operating in harmony and with respect to nature. We are required to assess the environmental impacts that are caused by our operations, and the licensing procedures within our sector are also based to a great degree on measuring and mitigating the impacts that we have or have not on the environment. How we measure and manage our impacts has therefore been vital for the company for a very long time. But we see the impacts of climate change directly in our operations. We monitor and research precipitation and glacial runoff in the Icelandic highland, and we see changes. We also see changes in the flora and fauna in the Icelandic nature. So we are aware of the crisis that stays ahead of us and that we're currently operating in. And these, among others, are the reasons for why we take climate and environmental issues seriously. We have a long experience in environmental management, establishing an environmental management system in 25 years ago, and we're constantly evolving it. In 2006, we published our first green account and also our carbon account. And in 2008, we committed to become carbon neutral. It was then in 2015 that Hörður Arnarsson, the CEO of Landsvirkjun, committed at COP15, the climate conference in Paris, to our commitments and targets. At that time, we were among few energy companies globally that were only generating renewable energy. Our carbon intensity was among the lowest known worldwide, and we believed that we were in a very good position looking at our climate change management. So we declared our commitments, and among our commitments were to become carbon neutral in 2030. We now have had a year for that, and to invest further in renewable energy. And we declared that we would publish information on our progress through CDP. And now looking back at that decision, I can say with confidence that that was a good one. But when we started submitting to CDP, we were, like I said, we had extremely low carbon intensity, only generating renewable energy, and we felt we were in a very good place. So we submitted to CDP, and what happened then? In 2016, confident as we were, we got the grade C. So out of A, B, C, and D, we scored C. And we thought, like, can this be? This means that we're just aware of the impacts that climate change has on the company and just aware on the impacts that we are causing to the climate. We're not managing it with C, we are aware of the problem. And we thought to ourselves, maybe we just have to answer the questions better. We just have to improve our submissions. So let's do that, okay, and we did. And in 2017, we got C. And we're like, wait a minute, is this the right tool for us? And that was like the first question that came up. And we started looking into the answers of other companies. Okay, yeah, we had the lowest carbon intensity looking at renewable energy companies, but they were doing a lot of other things. Transition plans into the future. We saw how they were taking decisions based on climate change and climate-related risks. And we could see that there were opportunities for us to do things better, to look at the risks and opportunities that were ahead and intertwine this into our management of how we work with the issue of climate change. So we improved our operations, not our submission to CDP, but we improved our decision making and implemented actions to improve how we managed our impacts and the impacts of climate change to our operations, and slowly starting to walk the stairs of CDP scores. And we are very proud that we this year, or last year, 2022, received an A and made the A list of CDP for climate change among 1.5% of reporting companies. So we are very, very happy with that. But we're also very proud of the steps that we have taken during that time. And what we have learned and how our climate management has evolved. I don't have time to go through every single action that we have taken, but I wanted to just sum up some of the key ones, the larger ones. So first off, all of our emissions, Scope 1, Scope 2, which is within our box, like Max mentioned, but also Scope 3, which happens in our value chain, is now verified by Bureau Veritas has been verifying a third party according to 14,064 with limited assurance, and also the biogenic emissions that are out of scope have been verified since 2018. And since 2020, all of our carbon sequestration has also been verified by a third party, the same third party. In 2019, we updated our climate action plan and climate targets, including, among others, a target to become carbon neutral by the end of year 2025, now 5 years earlier than we put forward in 2015, and to reduce emissions from geothermal by 60% compared to 2008. We are currently halfway there with the geothermal emission reduction. And we also said we would stop purchasing fossil fuel in 2030. We have adopted internal carbon price throughout our operations to assist us in taking better decisions and more informed decisions when it comes to climate impact from both our purchases and projects and our operations. We have also implemented our internal carbon price within our value chain with the newest adaptation concerning construction projects, where we, in 2022, for the first time, utilized carbon prices within construction biddings, impacting both the choice between offers, but also establishing incentives and obligations throughout the time of the project. And we've done this 3 times now since then. Throughout the year submitting to CDP, we have also learned quite a bit about climate-related risk assessment. We at Landsvirkjun historically are quite good at risk assessments, we believe, and we had been assessing physical climate-related risks, risks that are happening because of changes in nature. With our submission to CDP and the feedback that we got, we saw that, and looking at other companies, that we could improve our climate-related risk assessment when it comes to transitional risks. There are risks that are happening because of changes, for example, because of climate action, because of movements of governments into more sustainable, closer to sustainable development, legal changes, market changes, technical changes, and so forth. So we have done a thorough risk assessment now regarding both risks and opportunities. We have also implemented both policy and organizational changes that, among others, emphasize our aim to lead the way in climate and environmental affairs. We now have an executive vice president for environment and community sitting in the executive board and taking part in all of the major decisions within the company. The organizational changes reflect our focus on green solutions throughout our value chain and on our role in Iceland's targets to reduce emissions. Because climate change shouldn't be the responsibility of one department only, it's the responsibility of the whole company, and we must all work in climate-related matters. We at Landsvirkjun are focusing on reducing our own emissions. Our emission reduction targets account for are compared to about 3.5% of the emission reduction Iceland is currently obliged to within the emission sharing effort of the Paris Agreement. As a nation, we also have committed to eliminate fossil fuel by 2040, and currently a large part of our energy consumption is still fossil fuel based. To be able to eliminate fossil fuel, we must meet the energy need by using other measures. We believe we at Landsvirkjun play a key role in powering Iceland's energy transition. We must all support innovation and green solutions, and we are doing as well, since it is vital for sustainable development and national and global-wide climate action. It is vital that we all contribute to climate action. Whatever role we play, whatever our companies or organizations do, that we all take part in climate action and find how we can best not only reduce our emissions, but also accelerate the changes that are needed for sustainable development. Thank you, and I look forward to discuss this further in the panel with you all. Yeah, so Max, over to you.
Over to me. Yeah. Thank you so much, that was wonderful. And I believe you have the slides.
No, we don't have any slides.
Well, thank you so much for that, and it was amazing to hear about Landsvirkjunar's journey, because that's what it is about. It's about a journey that we're all going on in terms of how we achieve sustainability. And what was exciting to learn about was how you looked at that journey to how you connected with the entirety of your company, because it isn't just about the sustainability team. It's about how you integrate sustainability into your operations. And CDP is the perfect vehicle or framework to think about how you make those connections across your business to drive transparency and action. But today, we're going to look at that across the spectrum from our distinguished guests, looking at it both from a municipality perspective as well as an organizational governmental perspective and a corporate perspective. So I'm excited to welcome my guests today, the first being Halldór, who is the chair of the Icelandic Climate Council, a recognized international expert in the field of climate policy. He is a former senior director for the intergovernmental affairs at the UN Climate Change Secretariat, and we welcome your precious time and insights on Iceland's national and international climate policy. Welcome to the stage. And once again, Jóhanna, who is the Director of Climate and Green Solutions at Landsvirkjun, welcome back to the stage. It was amazing to hear the conversation so far, and I look forward to diving into more of what you spoke about. But you are overseeing the company's sustainability strategy and solutions, and Landsvirkjun, as Iceland's national power company, you play a powerful and vital role in the race to net zero in Iceland. So welcome to the stage again. Next, I'm glad to welcome Jóna, who is the head of Climate Change Unit, Departmental of Environmental and Planning in the city of Reykjavik, and you are overseeing the city's climate mitigation adaptation strategies, as well as the implementation of the city's internal environmental management system. And as Iceland's largest city, as well as one that has committed to become carbon neutral by 2040, I might add, we welcome you and your precious insights as well. And the lessons learned, that's what we hope to get today, is the lesson learned and challenges that exist for municipalities in that race to zero. Now, we've set the stage. We have our distinguished panelists, but let's proceed with the first question, and we're going to dive into 3 rounds. Starting off with the first round where we set the stage. This is, if you think about it from disclosure, insight, and action, which what CDP is about, let's set that stage with disclosure and to provide a brief context to Iceland's race to net zero and the role of each of you as stakeholders in Iceland's national sustainability efforts. And I'd like to put a little context around it before we dive into this first question that you'll all address. I think in the last few decades, Iceland has been extremely important and has taken extremely important steps in environmental climate policy. Iceland specifically is aiming to achieve carbon neutrality by 2040, as mentioned, and at cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030. And that is what their contribution, or that is what your contribution is, to the Paris Agreement. And as well as having a climate action plan updated in 2020, which contains 48 actions and is Iceland's main policy instrument to reach its goals of cutting emissions and reaching carbon neutrality. So, to dive into this and understand it better, I'd like to start with the first question to the Icelandic Climate Council, Halldór. As the chair of the Climate Council, can you briefly walk us through Iceland's efforts and main challenges it faces? And what is the role of non-state actors in these efforts?
Certainly, thank you very much, and it's great to be at this event, and it's so critical in this journey, as you underlined it being, to really think in systems, and that's not easy. We all know we need to do it, but we need to also be able to connect the dots and connect the aspects. And I think it's important to connect responsibility with transparency, with facts and figures and intentions, to actually really build a unified action and partnerships. And you asked where Iceland is on that journey. And I should preface my comments by saying, by law, we are expected to be difficult. We are expected to be kind of the voice of, in a sense, the conscience of Iceland on climate. And yes, we are starting in a good place, but we've been quite slow in actually understanding and really getting to the core of the things that need to change. The danger here is that when you take on a big challenge like this, the transformation is that you don't embrace the full transformation. You don't embrace the depth of the transformation. And I would say that Iceland is still on that threshold. And in some cases, I don't want to take examples here, Iceland has become attracted to intermediate solutions rather than full transformation. And so I would say that what is really happening now, and I see it kind of bubbling. I mean, I don't know if you've been to the glaciers in Iceland. I mean, things are bubbling in terms of both the private sector, municipalities, and the government, realizing that we are not there yet. And but also understanding that once you set your mind on it, things can happen very fast. And that's good thing. One of the good things about Iceland is they are kind of they're fishermen, they're hunters, they're opportunistic. When they realize what needs to happen, they can make things happen rather fast. So I'm still optimistic, but I think when we talk about optimism, it's not wishful thinking. I want to distinguish that. I think we do have reasons to be optimistic, but most of the really the transformative things are still ahead of us, unfortunately. But that's also exciting. So there are still opportunities, but only opportunities for those that actually are willing to both face reality, take the risk, and move.
And you know, I think we were having this conversation earlier. If we're talking about those big risks, because I think we are on the precipice of action, but that's going to take connecting the dots, as you said. And what role specifically do you see non-state actors playing across the ecosystem to be able to drive that forward, take that risk, recognize the action that needs to be taken?
First of all, we all need to take ownership of this.
Precisely.
Yes, and this is not something that will it won't happen by itself. So wishful thinking doesn't help, but it's not rocket science either, and that's something really important to realize, that the solutions are available, the technology is available, we have all of the means. It's more a question of acceleration and doing things faster, and also connecting the full value chain, connecting the system. And once you do that, you can really build unity of action and align the incentives. And so this is where I think the non-state actors, well, yeah, I mean, it's good to talk about state actors and non-state actors, but everybody has a role. And I think that's kind of really where we need to be focusing. What is my responsibility? But we should also be careful when we talk to the general public not to put this too much on their shoulders, because it calls for system change.
Yep.
So you mentioned that we have an action plan. Yes, we do, but we don't have a very clear vision on what needs to change. And that's really where I think non-state actors play a very important role in both calling for changes, but also leading the way on these changes.
I think that you hit the nail on the head there. And Jóhanna, as the Director of Climate and Green Solutions at Landsvirkjun, and about being able to show what the art of the possible is, or leading the way. I think one of the big themes that we've just touched upon is connecting the dots, to be able to drive system-wide action. And as Iceland's national power company, what role do you think that both the public and private enterprises play in order to unlock and achieve Iceland's climate targets? So you're not just at that near stage of bubbling up innovation, but you're actually moving that forward in achieving the Paris Agreement goals.
Yeah, thank you. I think, like, I want to just emphasize what Halldór is saying, like, that we all need to play our parts, and that definitely all of the players in the field, like, in a, like, you, describe this economy, like, as a whole, we all have different roles, and we need to find how can we not only reduce our emissions. It's important that all organizations look at, okay, what is my emissions, what is our organizational emissions, and we have to reduce that. That's very important, it's vital. But also to look at how can we support the acceleration of actions that maybe go beyond what you are doing in the core of the operation. So, and I think that is very important, and it goes quite hand in hand with what we at Landsvirkjun believe is our role. And if you look at the national commitments, that it's definitely, as well as reducing our own emissions, we need to be connecting the dots, and we need to be looking at how we can support innovation and green solutions that accelerate action against climate change and accelerate emission reduction, not in our boundary, but broader than that. And like I said in my talk, looking at fossil fuels, and that energy needs to be met with other sources, and preferably renewable. So I think our core responsibility lies in that.
Exactly.
But definitely it needs a lot of players to be...
A lot of players, and as essentially the national power company for Iceland, it begins with spearheading innovation, but it's not yours alone. It's your suppliers, it's your customers, as well as the policies that exist within local government and the national government that you operate in. So I think you've hit the nail on the head, and we're seeing a nice theme come out here. So that moves us to the city of Reykjavik. And as the head of climate change affairs at the city of Reykjavik, what role do you see municipalities playing in this system level of thinking and in Iceland's national policy that we've been discussing?
Exactly. Well, actually, municipalities have a twofold role in this one. We have the community-based emissions that are within the municipalities, but also due to our operations. But if you just name like numbers for Reykjavik City, when we are talking about community-based emissions, they are around 550,000 tons, but our operations are about 4,000. So you're seeing the different kind of numbers and what kind of effect you can have on the emissions, on community-based emissions. So the role of Reykjavik, of course, as other municipalities, is the planning authority. How we plan the city and for our residents, for their daily lives, just within the city. How to make it easier for you to commute to work with other means than the private car. We are having a rather sprawl city, and that is kind of what we are facing. But also make it more environmentally friendly, and to take the bike and so on. So to have the infrastructure ready for another kind of travel mode, but also planning. As you were mentioning, there is a rising population that will live in denser areas. So you have to keep the growth within a specific scope within the landscape. And well, Iceland's population and the Reykjavik's population is growing. So we still have to keep the growth limits of the city very dense as well. I'm, of course, talking from the capital city. We have been disclosing with you since 2015. But if we are, so I cannot maybe talk for other municipalities, but like rural municipalities, they also have the challenges of, travel modes and density and rising population. And you have to, how can you say it, to build the infrastructure for more dense parts is also, how can you say it, more climate friendly, but also less cost less cost effort with it as well. So it's a balance that can be found, but it's first and mostly by the planning authority that is, how can you say, that is the support to the climate goals of the nation as well.
And if we're thinking about it from this integrated perspective, obviously planning is going to be key to make sure that we create a city that's livable for people, but also where businesses can operate.
Exactly.
Does that take engagement as well with your citizens and the businesses that exist within your city's limit?
Well, we of course do it through the planning,
Yeah.
how to say, projects, and that is an obligation in Iceland to have, communication with the citizens, etc. But what we have been doing in Reykjavik is making more possibilities for the residents to change their private houses and so on, and changing the planning system to that one. It's neighborhood planning. That is a work in process. But then also just to talk about it a little bit, we are part of the Europe Mission Cities, 112 cities, and that is a planned structure that we are going into. We have a background of communicating with citizens online, having voting systems and so on. So that is something that we will integrate for climate issues as well. So
It's going to be necessary.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we've set the stage, right? We've kind of hear what this setting the stage exists and what the context is in Iceland. But let's now move to what the role of transparency and disclosure is in supporting sustainability strategies for collaboration amongst stakeholders. So continuing with this theme. And we're going to start with a question to the Climate Council. What role can and should transparency and disclosure play in improving environmental policy? And how is this reflected in Iceland's climate action program and policy?
Well, one thing that I think is critically important when we now start looking at disclosure and transparency is to also have the clarity of the direction. And one thing that I would want to especially note is how dynamic CDP has been in terms of the scope and always being kind of pushing the limits in terms of our understanding. Because let's face it, we haven't, as mankind, we haven't done this before, and one needs to avoid too much path dependency in terms of the transformative, how basically the theory of change, how things will really happen. And this is why I think once we move further into this, it's really important to have this kind of clarity on how things fit together. And yes, I realize that you need attention to detail. I'm not cautioning against that, but one has to make sure that it doesn't stay at the expert level. And having been involved or seeing CDP in action for some time, one of the strengths has been this effort to reach the leadership within the organizations.
Beyond.
Yes. And to empower the leaders also to talk about not just what they have achieved, but what they haven't achieved and what they're striving to achieve. And this is why I think this has to come in. I also want to have a cautionary note, and this comes from the work of the Climate Council, is that we have voiced some concern over carbon offsetting.
Agreed.
And this is a concrete example of where if you do it well, if you do it right, it's good. It can reduce cost, it can be a bridging approach, but it can also be deceptive and can also take us in the wrong direction. And this is why then also I think when we come to transparency, there has to be that kind of commitment to truth. I mean, truth is a big word, of course.
But important word.
Yes, and when I was working on this, one kind of a helpful way of framing it is to ask the question, will the atmosphere see this? will this be beneficial to the atmosphere? And that's why I think whenever we work on numbers and we work on disclosing what we're doing, it's really important to then also be able to ask the so what question, to take it all the way. And I think we need to have some kind of some humility there and honesty involved. And it's nothing wrong with pointing to that you haven't quite achieved things if you have clarity on your plans. And this is why, and to be very concrete on this conceptual framework, I think it's really important to now bridge together more climate and biodiversity. And yes, it made a sense to have different treaties on climate and another one on biodiversity. But in terms of what really needs to happen, it's very integrated. Yeah. And perhaps the best way of understanding that integration is in the food system, is in agriculture, where we are facing basically these triple threats of climate, biodiversity degradation, and pollution. And so I think it is important as we talk us through these things, what we need to understand, what we need to measure, what we need to disclose, that is very connected to where we need to change course and bring some sense of speed into it as well, how you can scale up solutions.
I think precisely, and we've been hearing about things being interrelated. I started out the conversation with the challenge of all of you today about how we bring interrelated environmental transparency to drive action. But the reason behind this is because the environmental crisis is interrelated. Our environmental systems are interrelated. And I think you've hit an important message here, and that is that climate and nature, they're essentially two sides of the same coin. And you cannot solve climate change without addressing our natural and nature crisis as well. And I think the main take-home message behind all of this, and this is what you hit on earlier, Jóhanna, is that you cannot manage what you do not measure. And that's exactly why I want to hear from both Landsvirkjun and the city of Reykjavik on the front of disclosure. First with Landsvirkjun, what has been your approach to environmental disclosure?
Yeah, I think if we look at just environmental disclosure, like you're saying, honesty is very important. And also to look at the impact that you might have or do have in a holistic way. So you look at what do we do as a company, as an organization, what is it that we do, and how does that impact the environment, nature, also people and communities. That's important as well. But how does what we do, how does it impact others? And I think it's just because you mentioned, we can take climate from nature and so on. It's the same coin, definitely. And I think we all must start to understand that sustainability won't in any means be reached without us looking at nature and us as part of nature. We need to think of, we have nature to depend on with all what we do. Societies are just of humankind is just part of nature, and then we have economy to move resources between those. It's all within the same, and we have to respect all of it in all what we do. And I guess we at Landsvirkjun, we have, like I said earlier, we have vast, long experience with monitoring the impacts that we cause on the environment and on nature, and now with climate as well. And I think looking at our CDP submission, and we submit to CDP with climate, and we've taken climate climate management quite strongly within CDP and through our operations now for the recent years. But definitely that helps us as well in regards to other environmental disclosures. The process that CDP provides, how you put it forward, you can copy that to other aspects of nature, definitely. To have governance over the issue, that the key stakeholders, leaders within the company, the highest rankings within the organization are aware of of nature, whether it's climate, whether it's biodiversity or pollution, they have to be aware and take responsibility for it. Then you go further into the CDP, like for example, and you take business model and funding, and you must look at those aspects in all of these steps throughout the corporation as a whole. Going into risk assessments and the same. So you can kind of replicate this throughout whatever the problem is that you're facing, or the parts of nature that you are impacting. And we at Landsvirkjun, we have been focusing on being both honest, but also it's okay to do, like when you're trying out new things, you say we need to accelerate things, we need to accelerate how we transform the norm. And by accelerating how you transform the norm, and to transform the norm, you will probably take actions that might not end exactly as you wanted them to do. Or you might do something, change, for example, a construction bidding, just because I mentioned it earlier. They have been done like the same way for a long time. You're changing some things. You're trying out new things, taking environmental aspects into those things, and you might have to. You might increase the risk of doing things a bit, differently, because you're changing the norm. And I think we have to be willing to do those things, of course, because we need to be able to change what we're doing, what we have done earlier. And be honest about also the mistakes that are happening.
I love that. Again, it's about a journey, and you're able to use CDP as a framework to drive your organization through that journey and see to the other side. And I'd like to hear that from the perspective of the city of Reykjavik, and how you have been using disclosure, and what have been some of the challenges as well as opportunities that you faced as a city through your journey of transparency.
Exactly. Because we have been part of Covenant of Mayors since 2011. So we have been disclosing with CDP since 2015, as I told you, and that has been a part of that journey. What I always find a little bit, it's so important to take the inventory at first. Way back then in 2011, it was like surprising that the private car was such a huge part of the emissions of the city. It still is, actually. Today, if we're talking about scope 1, it's 72% of the total emissions of the city. And, maybe we are not doing enough communication, because when I talk about this with people, they are surprised. Some people know about it, but not everyone. And what is very good is to have the transparency. We have a special website on climate issues at Reykjavik City, and what pushes us is that we have to disclose with you every year. So you really have to count the numbers again. So that is something that has pushed us, or me, forward to analyze the data and so on every year. But also on your grading system, we have 3 times been at A level city. But now, last year, we had the B grade level, and that, why did we not get the A grade, like you had the journey towards the grade within Landsvirkjun? And there was just some areas that we are very surprised by, but you are always pushing more. So when we maybe had the A grade, for some years ago, for the same effort that we're having today, but you were pushing, to have the limits always higher. So it's always been a learning curve when you get the B to be, because you want to be at the A level. And actually, as you were pushing forward to being an excellent city and to be A graded, was just to name an example, because I found it made me think about the aspects of planning and how you set the goals in the municipal plan on travel modes and so on, that you were talking about to limit the travel mode by private car even further than 50%. And I was talking with your colleague, and I thought we were ambitious about that part. But then she talked about you will have to include scope 3 emissions. It will grow, because the cars are made somewhere and they make emissions there, even if they don't make emissions here within the city, when we have the green energy and so on. So that made me think as well. I also want to talk a little bit more about transparency, because we have been making an emphasis on making everything public and having it on the website, and I find it extremely helpful to have like a limit or a plan on how this is done, and the scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions and so on, to just have some links that you can provide, and how the calculations are made, and also can provide into your website and so on. So it's good to have that kind of transparency for the citizens, but also my co-workers, and of course the politicians that come every 4 years. So that has to be very clear. Then you have the history as well. That I think it's very important.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is spot on the head here. But again, I go back to what we've been talking about, that we probably can't achieve this without collaboration.
Exactly.
So for anyone who wants to take this one, how do you think disclosure can enhance collaboration in efforts towards net zero?
I can start with this one. I think also relating to what we were discussing previously, like what we have done at Landsvirkjun is also to look at what you're suggesting is like we're trying to see what's next out there, best practice currently and next, and adapting it to our operations to improve what we are doing, but also to be able to bring that knowledge to Iceland, for example. Yes. And I can mention a few things: verified carbon account, internal carbon price, and sustainability-linked bonds and such things that we have done, like first in Iceland, and then being transparent about how we do these things and why we are doing it, and hopefully inspiring some others to do that as well. And I think this is very important. But I think it's important that we as well try to communicate on those actions and aspects, like what can we do? This is a tool we use, like internal carbon price, for example. It's a tool that has really benefited how we make decisions and benefited how we rank our climate action efficiently, and also take more action that we would have without that tool. So just an example would be to have a discussion about that. Is there something that somebody else can learn from that, can utilize this? And I think that is necessary as well, because if we're all in each of us corner, if we're all in the corners, different corners, we won't be able to, I mean, we'll all be thinking about what can we do, what should we do this? We'll all be making the same mistakes. So I think it's very important. And that's what I like as well with CDP, that it's open and accessible. So yeah, everyone here inside this room can access the CDP submission from Landsvirkjun by signing in, and that's completely, So I think being transparent about this and being able to read what other companies are doing, learning from those is key, definitely. And that goes across, companies or state-owned enterprises and organizations.
I think so. I mean, so I think this is hitting that point that I made earlier in our challenge for all of you today. There's a real opportunity in thinking about what economic-wide transparency could look like in Iceland, and what that opportunity could be for you as a signal. Perhaps you'd like to comment on.
Maybe I could just connect it also to action that the Climate Council took. For example, we could not make sense of the national budget and how it related to climate action, and to help on transparency on that, we basically had we did some research and to structure both on the income side and the expenditure side of the budget and how it related, how it all fit together. We haven't then taken that step yet to come up with recommendations, but we now have the fact header. And in terms of, you talked about cooperation and collaboration, one community I think is really critical here and is up to speed now is the investor community. And they are also being helped by, as you know, Iceland is part of the European Economic Area Agreement. So basically the vocabulary is much more stable now. And it's important that we're up to speed on that and we reach out to the investors, because many of them realize, and there's data to support this now, is that companies and our operations that have these things in order tend to have other things in order as well, and by that same token, they might be good investment. So you can attract more attractive investment by having good disclosure culture in your operation.
I think so, and I think there's a basis for innovation and business investment in Iceland as well, and that's what we hope to do from an economic transparency perspective. But to do that, we can't just look inwards, right? And I think in closing our remarks, I'd like to think about taking the Icelandic perspective abroad and the experience abroad to be able to showcase what's possible from an Arctic perspective, potentially thinking about opening Iceland up to investment, but also demonstrating a symbol of innovation and transparency and action to the rest of the world to follow suit. And how can Iceland's unique experience and inform the broader global debate around these issues? So I think to frame my question, that's going to be all over you in closing as we open up to questions here in the audience. For me, Iceland has, I think, a very unique approach to transparency, to disclosure, and this has translated into the environmental policy that's been integrated here from a governmental perspective and a municipality perspective. But to conclude our panel discussion today and open up the floor to your questions here in the audience, what are some of the key features of Iceland's environmental disclosure framework that make it particularly effective? And how could other countries learn from these practices? Perhaps starting at this end and working our way down in closing before we open up the floor to all of you.
Well, maybe I disappoint you, but I'm always very cautious when it comes to basically describing our state of affairs being something to emulate. But what I think might be a strength here is the fact that the system is manageable in terms of size.
Yeah.
And there is a fairly strong culture here of kind of accountability in terms of governance. But I think it's also very important that Iceland stays in a learning mode on this. And Iceland is now working more with other nations in terms of its green solutions, and we have outreach under the banner of Green by Iceland in terms of reaching others in terms of our solutions. But I think we need to also get our act together a little bit more at home. It's great to see what we've been hearing today here, but I think there are a lot of organizations in Iceland that have some catching up to do. And so perhaps that could be something that we could bring. Iceland does have fairly good infrastructure in terms of real-time information flows. And private sector companies that are working on that to make environmental information more current and fast. And that has helped some companies here to actually get a hold on, for example, their fossil fuel use and exactly what it is going into, and understanding the waste stream better. And so there might be some examples of that, and I know that some of those companies are now reaching other markets.
Definitely, and I think it's humbling to say where we are and where we aren't. Going back to the perspective that this is a journey, and I think we're all starting a conversation today about how we can progress Iceland on that journey. But being upfront about that journey, what stage you're on the journey, that in and of itself is something to demonstrate to the rest of the world. And I think, as you've said, with the size of the economy it is and the way that it's structured in a manageable way, I think there's a great opportunity to show the art of the possible. So from the corporate perspective, what do you have to add?
Yeah, to add, I think what you're saying with regards to access to data and so on, it's good here in Iceland. I think that's definitely something that is good in that direction. For example, we at Landsvirkjun, we have now established like a data dashboard, so all of our carbon emissions are actually accounted for like in a real-time dashboard. That's all of the employees can have a look at, and if you're responsible, like as an employee responsible for an emission factor, for example, or emission source, you would be able to see this. And this was something that was I mean, it took work to do, but the data was there. And what we see with like also looking at scope 3 and like our value chain, and what we see when we are engaging with our value chain regarding climate or other environmental aspects, we see ambitions and we see willingness to play, like to change things and do things differently. So I think in general, Icelanders are quite open to try out new things, quite opportunistic and optimistic as well. And I think we definitely can work with that in regards to climate action and environmental action and transparency. So I think we have a lot of good things going on. The size of the nation is as well a plus, I think, in regards to showing what can be done, and of course, like looking at renewable energy and so on, we have a lot to show also regarding, other aspects within the economy. So we have a lot of things that we could present and show an example, but definitely we, as everyone, have a lot to learn as well. Definitely.
Well, let's figure that out here today. But last not but least,
Yes.
from a municipality perspective,
Yeah.
a place where we as citizens live, where businesses operate, and where economies thrive, what can Iceland or Reykjavik show to the rest of the world in terms of what is possible?
Oh, exactly, that's huge words. I agree with both panelists here that we are very, how can you say it? We are very new, tend to be technical and very fast to bring on new ideas and so on. But at the same time, I'm a little bit worried about the municipalities in Iceland. We are very, Reykjavik is by far the largest one.
Yep.
And then we have 60 plus municipalities all around the country, and with a small population, but a huge country that we live in. So that is a huge task ahead, actually. You don't have the manpower for disclose to CDP or something else, so that can be a challenge mostly. So maybe that could also be a learning curve for other countries, and that is actually, how can you say, the goal with our participation with the European Climate Mission is to be one of the trial cities to be carbon neutral by 2030. So that will be a learning curve within that one. So yes, that is maybe, how can you say it? It's about the journey. That
It is.
can maybe be something learningful for others, I hope.
Well, I think we've heard it here today. It's about the journey, and we're all collectively, whether we are governments, city-states and regions, businesses, we're all here starting out a journey to transform the norm. With that, do we have a few minutes for audience questions? 1 minute is what you're saying. Do we have any questions here in the audience? If so, please raise your hand. Right here in the middle. You can shout it out. Microphone coming your way.
Thank you for this presentation. My name is Óttar. I'm CEO of Municipality Credit in Iceland, and I have two questions. One for Halldór, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I have a feeling that when you calculate carbon emission and you do this number for Iceland as a whole, there is, because you say it is important to measure so that you can change. So you can, what gets measured gets done.
Yeah.
And my suspicion is that what gets measured, for instance, with carbon emission of Iceland, is that when somebody from abroad travels to Iceland on holiday, it is Icelandic emission. Would it not make sense to discuss the fact that when I go to London and watch a football game, it is not somebody in London that is polluting. It is me going to London to see a football game or whatever, or a king being coronated. So, and because these are big numbers, and I think these are numbers which have a really big impact, and if you cannot impact the big numbers, the rest of the exercise becomes partly hopeless. Also, I have a question for Jóhanna regarding Landsvirkjun's plan to become zero carbon company in 2050. Because I'm just curious how you were to do these numbers, because about 10 years ago I heard that it takes a windmill 7 years to produce the energy that goes into producing the windmill. So I would be curious if the numbers are wrong. And secondly, I would also be curious, how long does it take for the power stations to produce the energy that goes into making them?
Okay, we've got some interesting questions. Let's start here.
First on the accounting and how to account for emissions, there are a couple of things we need to accept, basically, is that when it comes to accountability of states, it was agreed when this was all built and negotiated that each country is responsible for the emissions that happen within its economy. And that's the national accounting that goes every April to the UN and also to our partners in Europe. And I think that's unavoidable. And if you look at it, what it means for Iceland, Iceland needs to be strategic in terms of, for example, what kind of tourism Iceland wants to invest in and build up to be able to actually control the growth of emissions. Having said that, there's also that individual responsibility that is hugely important as well. And this is why also understanding very well your own footprint. And we definitely need, even though treaties are based on this national responsibility for emissions within a territory, we also need to be looking at our kind of indirect impact and be more responsible in terms of how we behave and a lot of things that have huge impact that we overlook. For example, both shopping, ordering jeans all the way from China and then sending them back because they don't fit is irresponsible. And so we need to have that, and there's also a lot of emissions associated with using the internet that people overlook. So we need to combine both. States are responsible for what happens within their territory, and they need to develop economic policy with that in mind. But as individuals, we also need to take responsibility for our own footprint.
I think, I can just take the word from here. If you look at corporates and companies as well, then it doesn't matter where the emission occurs. You should take into account both emissions that occur within your operations, which is called Scope 1, but also Scope 3 emissions, that is emissions that occur because of what you do in maybe other regions, at other companies, and so on. So if we were to buy pants from China, we would, as a company, that would be included in Scope 3. But of course, then it comes to, are you going to measure all? Are you going to measure 80%? And how you do it? And I think looking at environmental transparency, we at Landsvirkjun, we look forward to and are happy with the changes that are happening now with the European legislation regarding sustainability disclosure, and that, Scope 3 emissions, for example, are becoming more and more critical to be published.
Using your influence and your spheres of influence, which is important.
Exactly. And your questions regarding our carbon neutrality. So we have set the target to become carbon neutral by end of year 2025. We take into account in our climate account both Scope 1, 2, 3, and out of scope emissions. So they are all included in these in the target. But we also have quite vast amount of carbon sequestration here in Iceland that currently accounts for most part of our emissions already. Carbon neutrality by end of year 2025 is definitely something we believe is reachable, and we're aiming for that and utilizing both the tool of internal carbon price and data transparency with the real life dashboards and taking decision based on our climate impact.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Was there one more question here as well?
Thank you. My name is Thorsten. I'm at Statistics Iceland. Just a quick note, the NIR reporting refers to the emissions that happens within the land space of Iceland, not the economy. Mm-hmm. There's a separate accounting for that. Yeah. I had a question regarding these. My first question was essentially that when you're mentioning Icelandic commitment toward climate goals, and carbon neutrality, you're considering a very small subset of the total climate impact of Iceland, which is much greater than just the fugitive emissions from energy production and fuel consumption, like concrete from construction and groceries imported by air are not included in this. Do you think it should be mandatory to report Scope 3 emissions, even if there is a risk of double counting? For example, you can't estimate 80%, you would just estimate all of it. So we're double counting the emissions to give ourselves bigger footprints the further we reach. Do you think that should be a mandatory part of reporting, or do you think that that runs the risk of data entropy and people getting confused about what is the actual reporting? Because we're reporting this as a CO2 emission when it isn't emission. It's more like an indicator or index of our scope. Thank you.
Who would like to start in this question? I mean, I have my view, but so. Would you like to start out since you were?
I can start out.
From a municipality and from a country perspective as well.
I think it's very important that we look at emissions not based on where they occur, but just emissions as they are, and how what we can do to reduce them or affect some decisions so those emissions will be reduced. So I think we will have to be cautious in putting ourselves in boxes regarding that. But again, looking down at the European sustainability standards that have now been published as a draft and we're expecting in June, and a more improved regulatory framework regarding sustainability information, I'm really happy that we are seeing Scope 3 being taken quite seriously there, and that you need to have those emissions verified by a third party, as you do with other emissions. I think that is close to what, but again, important that we look at this in a holistic way. And I got the question that earlier because of, if we look at lifetime impact of energy generation, and I think it's important that we look at those things in a broad manner, and regarding the energy efficiency and how much time it takes back and so on. Just wanted to emphasize that our constructions, for example, are part of our climate account.
To both of you, the idea of Scope 3 being mandatory, or is it causing confusion by double counting?
I really find this question very good, and that's why I'm hesitating to jump on it. But perhaps the point I would wish to make also at this point is we need to connect to the decision making.
Yeah.
And so the presentation of information needs to be tailored to decision making, make it usable for decision making. And that's why I think that's the challenge, and that's why it needs to be a constant conversation between the policy-making community and the number crunchers, if we use that in a positive way. And I think that's missing in Iceland, I must say. The Environmental Agency is starting to build that up a little bit with an annual event on climate information, and I think the statistics aspect of it is critically important. So perhaps rather than looking for one way of presenting things, we need to be able to tailor the information to the decisions that are being made or considered, while making, of course, things internally coherent. So we are not fooling ourselves. But if we have a choice, we need to be erring on the side of inclusivity, I would say, rather than exclusivity. And it's better to take too much responsibility than too little.
Closing words from the city of Reykjavik.
Okay. well, actually, I have been disclosing since 2011. And then we were just looking into Scope 1 because the data was so weak at that time.
Yes.
And of course it has been building up on that, but it's been like the last 2 years that we have been making some kind of estimation on Scope 3 emissions. And as the data is weak, I cannot trust it, and I approach it in that way. But as the data evolves, we think we should go more into the mandatory level of making published data as well. Because again, as I was talking about the European mission, they are talking about scope 1 and 2 to be carbon neutral by 2030, but they also saying right now that we will have scope 3 included after 2030. So it is growing that it will be included, but I don't think we are ready for it quite yet. But yes, it's the journey again.
Follow-up question, and then we'll move it to a closing.
So when you're talking about changes in policies, are you referring to national policies pushed or not pushed by the government? Or are you hoping that the policies are set by private companies? And the question is, therefore, would you support strict policies set by the government, such as carbon quotas or travel production and construction, that might actually impact what you can or cannot do? Would you support that kind of a regulation?
Maybe the short answer is yes, definitely. And I think we've done most of the easy things. We now need to start doing some of the tough things. And but we need much better understanding of the internal dynamics of the things that we are trying to manage. And just one example of that is that we are very concerned with the fossil fuel use of domestic transport. But we have a very limited and very poor understanding of the dynamics, and we don't have models, active models used. They exist in Iceland, but they're not being used by the government. So I think policy making really needs to be that by the policymakers, and they need to roll up their sleeves much more and get much more into the nitty-gritty of actually bringing down these emissions. So and there will be a need for regulations, but they need to be well informed so they actually bring us closer to where we need to be.
And well informed means starting with the data.
Yes.
And I think we've heard some important things here today, especially on your great question about scope 3. Oftentimes, according to CDP data, scope 3 is 12 times larger than a company's own internal four walls or boundaries of scope 1 and 2. And I love what you said, and let's put it on this note. Too much accountability is never too much. Mm-hmm. That's what's going to be necessary to transform the norm. So thank you to all of you today for this conversation. We look forward to driving economic transparency with all of you in Iceland.
Thank you.
Well, welcome back, everybody. I really much enjoyed that panel conversation with all of you. I hope you feel refreshed, you got a little coffee in your system, and you're excited to get on the day. But we've been talking a lot about CDP and it being a journey. So I hope that you enjoyed the discussion where we confronted what that journey looks like, the steps that we need to take, and many thanks, of course, to all of our fabulous speakers today for your insights on that journey from disclosure to insight and, of course, to action. We heard about the critical roles for cities. We heard about the critical roles for companies and financial institutions in meeting Iceland's environmental goals together, because that's what it's about together. It's joining those dots, as we discussed. And we were really excited to hear about that from Landsvirkjun, CDP A-lister for the first time this year, and from the city of Reykjavik, a previous A-lister who's still on that journey, because that journey does not end, as we learned. We keep progressing until we reach net zero and nature positivity. And we discussed how disclosure and collaboration, they go hand in hand to drive environmental action. And Angele and I, looking forward to Angele coming up soon to have a conversation as well, and joining me from CDP, would like to explain CDP's role here a bit further to all of you. And we're going to explain how we support cities, how we support public authorities, and how we drive action amongst companies and financial institutions to ultimately transition together, to transform the norm. Now, for those of you, even though we've been having quite a bit of a long conversation about CDP, who hadn't heard of us prior today, that's okay, because you're in good company. The Harvard Business Review actually once called us the most powerful green NGO that you never heard of. But that's what we're here about. We're lucky that many of you already have and are stepping up, because this is about stepping up. And CDP For those of you who don't know us, we run the world's environmental disclosure system. And essentially what we do is we link businesses and their customers with global financial markets, with governments, and we link cities with national policymakers, with local businesses, with investors, and we do that through disclosure. Disclosure is the key to the success. It's the magic sauce, if you will. And impactful data is what lives underneath that, right? It's lighting up the system so decision makers can spot companies, can spot cities with ambition and with needs to a sustainable economy that works for both people and planet. So Angela Merkel said this about us: this data drives progress. It's a win-win, and I see the progress being made every year. When asked by CDP for this data, it's not just us. We are backed by some of the world's biggest investors who are actually asking for this information. Investors like BlackRock, like Vanguard, and Amundi. They are relying on this data for investment decisions, as well as global supply chains. Some of the biggest customers asking for this information in the world, like L'Oreal and Volvo Cars. CDP is a non-for-profit, and we are funded by the EU, and we're working closely to deliver the Green Deal and be a climate-neutral EU. And the EU's climate bank, the European Investment Bank, is among the investors who back our information requests and are using this data from companies and cities annually. Now, the result is that over the past 20 years, we have helped make transparency the norm. And Landsvirkjun and many other companies here within Iceland, but we still need many more, are a part of this journey. And they're part of those 20,000 organizations that are now disclosing. And now that we've started, it hasn't just become the norm as of yet. It's on that precipice. As mentioned, it's bubbling up. And the reason why this bubble is going to get more furious and faster is because it's becoming law. CDP, though, is there to help us go beyond regulation. We want to take companies to nature positivity and to net zero because the IPCC says, as I mentioned prior, it is now code red for humanity. And we are at a point of no return. And we cannot allow Iceland's glaciers to melt. We can't allow that to happen. To lose your critical fisheries and industries, to lose 60% of global marine life. That is essentially what we're facing. Now, to change that, we need collaboration between everyone in our economy and society, and collaboration, as you could see here, is key. A third of cities working with us say that their climate plans rely on national government. For example, import bans on non-electric cars. 3/4 are already collaborating with businesses to achieve their climate targets. But European cities still need about $17 billion. That's a huge number, $17 billion for ready-to-go climate-related projects. And data that governments need from private investors and the EIB, they get that from CDP. Now, the key areas for this collaboration are in local governments, and these are typically hotspots, as you can see: transport, waste, adaptation projects, and behind all of this is ultimately collaboration. Transparency is that bedrock for action, and you cannot manage what you cannot measure, as we've been discussing today. It is only through system-wide transparency and collaboration that we can transform the norm. For companies and cities, the CDP score, it's essentially therefore seen as a global gold standard for environmental performance. And I'd like to recognize Landsvirkjun for achieving a position on the A-list after 6 years of improving your climate performance, because you have embarked on that journey, and because of it, you're now seeing success within your organization. So well done for your leadership. Now, what is CDP's climate change questionnaire about? It's actually quite comprehensive if you look under the hood of it. It covers governance, it covers risks, strategy, and targets in all actions to essentially align your corporate sustainability strategies with a 1.5-degree goal. It takes you on that journey from disclosure to leadership and throughout that entire process, looking at it as a framework. And for any company that is new to disclosure, we welcome you to the process. Our system, it's now open. It opened just a few weeks ago, and we're holding webinars to now capacity build and support you through your first time of disclosure. But as mentioned today, it is a journey, and we are continually improving our system to ask the right questions, to get under the hood of your organizations and push towards net zero and 1.5 and nature positivity, to drive environmental progress in line with CDP's mission to create an economy that works sustainably for people and planet. Now, for example of how we're pushing that norm, this year, for example, we've made improvements on our questionnaire. For example, around the governance section, we've increased the focus on how companies are transitioning to net zero. On the strategy front, we're now asking companies how they align with the EU taxonomy. On targets, we're ensuring we're science-based and we're driving high ambition, upping the game and more and more. And this is how CDP supports companies to put in place credible plans to transition to 1.5 degrees, starting with disclosure as that first step, putting in place next the governance, setting the targets, and then of course ultimately building credible climate transition plans aligned for 1.5 to showcase how you're going to meet your ambition. And what is at the center of all this data that you provide, that investors and companies are asking for you as businesses, and what the European Union is now making law. And CDP is here to ensure that your sustainability action is rewarded. By reporting through us, we get your information out into the world, and it underpins capital markets, rating agencies, information that NGOs use, stock exchanges, governments, civil society. That makes CDP ultimately using your data as the foundation for the environmental and social governance world, as you can see up on the screen. Companies that lead stand to gain. And that's why we want to get your data out there into the world. We work with stock exchanges to set up indices targeting companies with 1.5 degree targets to ensure that they're either being engaged with, listed, or deselected. With investors to rate funds only for CDP leaders, and with banks who are now using CDP scores for loan results. Now, I mentioned that climate and nature are two sides of the same coin. And as the world's environmental disclosure system, CDP, we ourselves are transforming to make sure that we are driving change where the world needs it. And we're moving essentially from this, which is just climate change, forests and water, the typical areas that we have covered for the past few years. And we're asking for companies to report beyond that now to this, to cover all planetary boundaries in Earth systems. Because as I said, nature and climate are two sides of the same coin. And new this year is we have added biodiversity for the first time. And we've just received back that information, and the result that we're finding from the disclosures around biodiversity is that we now have the largest database ever on how companies are performing on this topic. And what we've seen in the first year, it's quite clear. Companies, they're still blind to the real impact on biodiversity. Perhaps not so surprising, but that's going to be more and more important as it's becoming an issue and as the EU law is going to make it mandatory to act on very soon. So this year, CDP is now evolving even further than we have before. Nearly 7,000 companies were asked to report and will be asked to report on their plastic-related impacts for the first time ever. The scale of the plastic pollution issue, it's no secret. We see it around us every day. It's part of our daily lives. Yet the data on the issue of plastics and how it's impacting our economies and communities and the settings that we live and operate within is actually severely lacking. And it's going to be necessary to have this data to bring change to global oceans and ecosystems, because nearly half of all plastics that we use globally are in are in packaging. So that impacts all of us every day. And one estimate actually suggests that companies could face up to $100 billion if made to cover plastic waste in their costs. And at CDP, we're starting to see and add new standards that are becoming in law. Part of our mission and strategy is to scale the most important standards to drive beyond regulation, but ensure that we're creating an easier pathway for companies to harmonize around that regulation. And key to this is going to be the EU taxonomy. And this is essentially the world's first green list for how sustainable activities can be achieved and classified. And starting this year, we're going to be asking you to report on your strategy and how your spending is aligned with the EU taxonomy. Now, from this perspective, Iceland is quite unique. Your mission's impact, it's not energy. It's industry, it's transport, it's fishing and waste and agriculture. And that means that ultimately we need the government to stand up, because they also need to look at it from an economic perspective, because they need businesses and they need cities to be able to provide the right data and set out plans for action based on the art of the possible. So with that, I want to thank you for stepping up, whether you are a company, a city, an investor, or the government here of Iceland. And thank you for working with CDP, because we are on a critical journey and mission together. And mentioned today, I think it was important that we talked about that CDP is not going to stop pushing. We're not going to stop pushing for a system that works for people and planet. And I encourage you all to also not stop pushing, because that's exactly what we're trying to do here today. We need to push. We need to go farther. And we're only going to secure a livable future and a livable world if we are serious, if we are credible, and if we collaborate. That is a key thing that we talked about, is collaboration. And that collaboration is only going to make it feasible if we transform the norm. So with that, have a great rest of the day. I look forward to the conversations, and let's drive economic, system-wide transparency together here in Iceland. Over to my colleague, Angele.
Thank you, Maxfield, for this very inspiring presentation, and thank you everyone for making the time to be here. I'm Angele Cauchois, so I'm from CDP. I'm the Senior Public Authority Officer at CDP. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to pick up Maxfield's last line on an ecosystem of actors, and I'm going to try to present to you what we've been doing not only with corporate actors, but also with actors from the public sector and the para-public sectors. So we've seen in the panel discussion, and Maxfield have been touching a little bit upon it, we really need everyone on board to achieve environmental action. And we've seen a little bit in the presentation before that CDP has been doing a tremendous work with companies to do that. But CDP has also been working with other actors, for example, the city of Reykjavik. So it's been working with cities, states, and regions, as well as public authorities. So what I'm going to do now is to first present you a little bit what CDP has been doing with cities in particular, and a bit later I'm going to tell you what we plan to do with public authorities as well. But before I start, maybe I should set up the context, because as we all know, cities now are becoming increasingly important and increasingly massive on the planet. It's more than 50% of the world's population now live in cities, and the trend is not going to go any time slower. In fact, it is expected that 2/3 of the world's population is soon going to be urban in the next 20 years. Now, massive human settlements means massive environmental impact. First, 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions are coming from cities or activities happening in cities. So that's quite massive. But it's not only in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, of course, it's also about biodiversity loss, soil degradation, water pollution, water depletion, you name it. Cities are responsible for a tremendous amount of environmental degradation. Now, cities have an impact. cities also are vulnerable. It is estimated that about 90% of the urban population actually live on coastal areas, which means that in a world where climate is going to change or is already changing, this population is vulnerable to extreme storms events, vulnerable to flooding, vulnerable to sea level rise. So there is a tremendous challenge here. But who says challenge also says opportunity. If we work with cities of more than 100,000 inhabitants, climate action, and if we do climate action with the cities, it is expected that we could actually lessen by 40% the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions that are necessary to achieve the Paris Agreement goal of 1.5 degrees. So cities extremely, extremely important. And so this is in this context that CDP, after studying its work with companies, after a few years of trying out different things with companies, have also started a program with cities, states, and regions. So in this presentation, I'm really only going to focus on cities because otherwise it's just too much information. But since 2014, we've had at CDP more than 350 different cities disclosing to CDP in Europe only. Europe understood as geographical Europe, including the UK, including part of Turkey and Iceland as well. So far in Iceland, we've had, as we've known from the panel, we've had the city of Reykjavik, with whom we've done a lot of work and which has done a lot of work when it comes to climate disclosure. But we also have Akureyri, and what we're trying to do here is really to get everyone on board. So this year, we've been inviting 9 different municipalities from Iceland to disclose as well to CDP. Now, I'm talking about 350 different cities, but what does that actually mean when we say we want cities to disclose? Because the program is slightly different from the one that Maxfield has been talking about when it comes to corporate stakeholders. The CDP program on cities have a specific targeted questionnaire whose scope encompasses all the different aspects, environmental aspects that are relevant to cities. Cities are multidimensional entities and they have impacts on all different aspects, right? It's not only greenhouse gas emission, as I mentioned earlier, it's also about nature, biodiversity loss, water pollution, water degradation, and all of that. We really try at CDP, we really try to capture all of those different dimensions within the city's questionnaire. So the core of it, the core of the logic of the program really is really what's at the core of the DNA of CDP as well, is really try to get cities on board, first of all. The city of Reykjavik has been mentioning in the panel that 10 years back, the data was really poor. The data that cities had was really poor. And so what we're trying to do is just to help city identify where the data gaps are, how to get them on board, and then from there, try to get to good management practices and then leadership. So, for example, we've been from the data, because we've been collecting quite a bit of data over the year, right, on cities, and we've seen that now about 86% of the cities that have been disclosing to CDP actually have a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So it's become a pretty common practice by now, even though 20 or 30 years ago that was not the case. But what we see when we still look at the data is that, as mentioned in the panel, only 11% of those cities actually do try to get into account scope 3 emissions and indirect emissions as well. So there is still a long way to go here. Similarly, we have 93% of greenhouse gas emission reduction targets are set by all the cities that have been disclosing to CDP. But when it comes to net zero targets, like the one the city of Reykjavik has been setting, we only have 21% of our cities that actually have net zero targets. So it's quite a low number, and yet still a long way to go. And just to give a last example, the vast majority of cities now have a climate action plan, either adaptation plan, mitigation plan, or holistic plan, but only 15% of them specifically address vulnerable groups in those climate action plans. So again, so much has been done, but so much is still to do. So with this questionnaire comes also a scoring in a bit of a similar fashion than the one for the corporate questionnaire that Maxfield have been mentioning, starting with simply disclosure, just getting on board, getting familiar with the data, what's there, what's lacking, what's needed. And then from disclosure, moving on to awareness, from awareness, moving on to management and good management practices, and then to leadership. Now, the cities program has been doing a lot of different things. And so I'm not gonna bore you with all the different things that the city, states, and region program has been doing. But as a conclusive remark, I'm just gonna invite you, if you're interested in the work that the program has been doing, to go on the website cdp.net and then look at the open data portal. Because what's quite fantastic about this program is that it's completely free to participate, but the whole data is also completely free to access for anyone who visits the CDP website. So that's quite a bit of data there, also quite a bit of case studies, insights. So if you want to know more about the program, it might be a good place to start. So that's where I'm gonna leave you with cities. But we've seen through the panel, and Maxfield have been emphasizing it as well, we need everyone on board. We don't only need corporate actors and cities, we also need literally everyone. And so what I'm going to talk about now is the work more recent that CDP has been doing with public authorities. So I'm going to start with like a 10, 15 minutes, just very theoretical introduction to what we mean by public authorities, because it's not necessarily clear all the time. And then we're going to have an online intervention by Eric Wilson from the New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority, who's been doing quite a bit of work in the transportation sector in New York. The New York Transportation Authority is actually the biggest one in the USA and has been disclosing to CDP via the Public Authorities Program. Now, unfortunately, Eric Wilson could not be there with us on live. So it's going to be a recording, and after that, it's going to be a Q&A if we have the time for it. So, just to place it back, we've been talking about all the work that CDP has been doing with corporate actors, and it's been quite a bit because it's been more than 20 years, right? I just mentioned briefly what CDP has been doing with cities. Now, between the public sector and the private sector, there is these type of entities that are most often time public, sometimes private, but that do perform a number of public services, oftentimes of environmental nature, and that were not captured in the work that CDP was doing. And by these actors, I mean public authorities. So an entity most often created by the government carrying out a specific public service and oftentimes operating critical infrastructure. So that can be airports, ports and marina, public transportation, highways, bridges and tunnels, waste management, public utilities, water management, public utilities, public housing, or finance and development agencies. Now, this definition, this program is global, right? So obviously public authorities, because they're so tied to the state and the historical formation of states, have different structures depending on which country they are in. So in certain cases, airports in certain countries are fully private, in others they're not. So it's really a program that really aims at capturing all those different nuances to get everyone on board for environmental disclosure. So why should we care? Like, what are so important about public authorities? Well, basically, it's a bit of the same story than the one for cities. Public authorities, critical infrastructure have a major environmental impact, social impact, and economic impact as well. They are very much vulnerable to climate change. And as a last thing, there is a massive need for investment there. So if you switch your perspective from cities, we were saying that 70% of the world's emissions are coming from cities. You could also say that 79% of those same emissions are actually coming from critical infrastructure. Most of the time, the main sectors are energy, buildings, and transport. But of course, infrastructure and public authorities do not only have an environmental impact in greenhouse gas emissions, but also in all the aspects of the environment, namely biodiversity, water loss, etc. We know the story by now. Critical infrastructure is also very much at risk of a lot of different climate change-induced natural hazards. Sea level rise, increased frequency of hurricanes, drought, floods, you name it. Critical infrastructure is a lot of the time placed in areas which are very much vulnerable to the massive change in climate that we are facing. To give you just one example, out of the 100 biggest, busiest airports on the planet, you have 25% of them that are placed less than 10 meters above sea level rise. And among them, you have large airports, such as the airport of New York or the airport of Shanghai, who are actually located less than 5 meters away above sea level. So you do have massive vulnerability when it comes to that. Another example, the port of New Orleans is very much exposed to extreme weather events, and Hurricane Katrina in 2005 destroyed 30% of the entire port. So vulnerability there, and that is likely to increase as the climate is also likely to change. That brings about a lot of financial costs, and those financial costs are of two sorts. On the one hand, you will have an increased amount of money that will need to be dedicated to the yearly damage that will be caused by increased weather events. On the other hand, you will also need a tremendous amount of investment for mitigation and adaptation efforts. So this data on the PowerPoint is coming from a fairly recent report from UNOPS and the University of Oxford, and basically it's just assessing the percentage of the total cost that should be dedicated to adaptation and how much of these should go to critical infrastructure. And as you can see, adaptation efforts are very much linked to adaptation of infrastructure. So it is in this context that the Public Authorities Program came about, and that's pretty new in the history of CDP because it has 2 years old, and it started out in North America. It was developed by the CDP North American team initially based on discussion that they had with a number of different public authorities within the state of New York. So basically what was happening there is that you had public authorities within the state of New York that really wanted to disclose, really wanted to start the sustainability and disclosure journey, but then didn't feel that the CDP corporate questionnaire was actually a fit, and they were not either a municipality. So that's how it came about, a few discussions and collaboration, and then the development of a new questionnaire and a new program. It was developed in collaboration with about 20 different public authorities and investors in North America. And it's pretty much, I mean, it has a CDP signature in it. It's pretty much adapted to the needs of the public authorities consulted. So it started 2 years ago, and we have a number of different partners in North America, different people that, entities, public authorities that have accepted in participating in the pilot. So I talked about New York Power Authority, Long Island Power Authority, Philadelphia, or the Port of New Orleans are all now discussing via this program at CDP. And this year we're starting with Europe, always with the same idea, same approach that has been the DNA of CDP since its inception, measuring, monitoring so that we can manage. It's starting this year, and it's going to start at the end of June. Now, this is all very theoretical, to maybe give you a more concrete idea of how it worked out for one particular public authorities, I'm going to leave the floor now symbolically and virtually to Eric Wilson, who is who works at the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the largest transportation authority in the USA, who will explain to us a bit more about the background of these public authorities, the different challenges that the public authorities have been facing, as well as how they use disclosure and the public authorities question in particular to advance on their sustainability journey. So.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for asking me to join the conversation virtually. My name is Eric Wilson. I'm the Vice President of Climate Resilience and Sustainability Planning at the New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York City, and I'm thrilled to be joining this conversation. I'm going to go ahead and start off the discussion with this slide here. This is a picture of our Long Island Railroad train with the words, "Fight climate change, no driving required." The New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority provides transit services for New York City and the surrounding metropolitan region. So we like to think of ourselves as really the anecdote of climate change, especially in the US, where the largest share of our GHG emissions is from transportation. So getting into the discussion for today, I'd like to acquaint you with the MTA's organizational structure related to climate issues, share with you some climate actions that we are undertaking, and then also share some reflections from our 2022 CDP Public Authorities Disclosure and some takeaways from our experience with completing that process. So starting off with the MTA's organizational structure. So as I mentioned, the MTA is the transit provider for New York City's metropolitan area. We're the largest transit authority in the United States, serving an area with a population of 15.3 million people all around New York City, including upstate New York, Long Island, and the west side of the Hudson River. We operate the city's subways system, bus system, as well as the regional railroads with Metro North and Long Island Railroad, and then a network of bridges and tunnels that surround New York City and are open to vehicular as well as bicycle and pedestrian transportation. So all of these different elements of the MTA are organized in a structure where planning is consolidated within an organization called Construction and Development. And this is the group that I'm in. Construction and Development serves a few different functions. The one that's relevant for this conversation is this first one, which is Assemble the Capital Program. All of these agencies, as we start thinking about the long-term capital needs for the subways, buses, railroads, bridges, and tunnels, it's the role of our team to start thinking about how climate resilience and sustainability, climate risk mitigation and greenhouse gas emissions reductions figure into our long-term capital plans. And that was what our group was started to accomplish. So the size of our capital plan is not small. It's actually quite large. So, on the left here, our assets are valued at about $1 trillion US dollars, just our existing assets. And over our last capital plan, we had been allocated $55 billion US dollars to maintain these assets and to expand the system in a few locations. On the right, the pie chart illustrates the proportion of this $55 billion. More than 85% goes towards just maintaining the existing system, and then the remainder goes towards expanding the transit system. So you can see the magnitude of capital spend that we have and the way that we try to think about how climate sustainability and climate resilience are going to inform some of these investments. So I mentioned there's several objectives associated with our capital planning, but really front and center going forward is to think about risk mitigation as well as GHG emissions reductions. Okay, so I want to acquaint you a little bit with some of the climate actions that we've been undertaking as a public authority. So I had mentioned in the US, transportation is actually the largest carbon emitter of all other economic sectors nationally. contributing more than a quarter of the US's greenhouse gas emissions. This is largely from single occupancy vehicles that make up the majority of transportation systems in the majority of US cities. This chart illustrates why transit is so much lower in terms of greenhouse gas emissions as a transportation provider. Starting on the right, or I'm sorry, on the left, we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions per passenger mile associated with ride-hailing services, going towards the right, single occupancy vehicles. And then the next three columns on the right illustrate transit. Our diesel buses, regional rail, and finally subways each emit a fraction of the greenhouse gases per passenger mile compared to ride-hailing services or single occupancy vehicles. And this is really why, on a per capita basis, New York City residents have a much lower greenhouse gas emissions footprint compared to the typical American. We've undertaken a process recently to quantify the transit avoided carbon associated with our services. And there's a few different metrics that we've used to measure transit avoided carbon, not just shifting transportation needs from single occupancy vehicles to transit, but we've also quantified the greenhouse gas emissions associated with fuel production and transportation, the improved efficiency and less congestion of the roadway network because of the presence of transit, and then also the enhanced level of biking and walking and other sustainable transportation modes that accompany transit use when there are dense land uses that facilitate those kinds of connections. And we've estimated that the MTA transit services avoid more than 20 million metric tons of carbon emissions annually. This is a huge figure and very, very significant nationally within the US. Looking at the US Environmental Protection Agency, we've calculated that this is about the same amount of carbon that's sequestered by a forest equivalent to the size of the US state of Indiana. The same emissions driven from a car driving 51 billion miles, or the emissions from generating electricity used in 3.9 million typical homes in the US. A lot of carbon is avoided through transportation services that our public authority provides compared to transportation patterns that are more typical in other US cities. So while we recognize that cutting emissions is a priority, we really want to do so carefully so we're not impacting our riders. The last thing that we want to do is displace riders if our system becomes more expensive or less reliable or less safe or less accessible. We want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on those things as we are starting to choose alternative technologies and decarbonize, because the last thing we want to do is decrease ridership. In fact, we want to increase ridership and increase our services in order to continue to have the regional greenhouse gas emissions benefit that we have. We have just set our own greenhouse gas emissions reduction target. We're going to reduce our own emissions by at least 85% by 2040 from a 2015 baseline. And we're looking forward to continuing the CDP public disclosure process to measure our progress against this greenhouse gas emissions baseline. Just a little bit about our greenhouse gas emissions. We emit about 20 million metric tons as a result of our operations every year. And these are roughly equally distributed between our bus system, the buildings, facilities that we maintain, our subways, and our commuter rail, which are both run by electricity as well as diesel power. And with our electricity consumption, the majority of our emissions, at least in 2019, were indirect emissions that result from electrical production. The other portion of our emissions were direct emissions resulting from combustion of fossil fuels associated with our buses and our diesel locomotives. Switching to the climate resilience side, I would say the most impactful moment for the MTA was when Hurricane Sandy hit New York City in October of 2012. And it was very instructive for us in recognizing that New York City is not immune to the impacts of climate change, and that going forward, we really need to be accounting for climate risks and vulnerabilities that face our region. This is a flooded subway station at the southern tip of Manhattan, the South Ferry station that filled with water with the storm surge. And we've been very busy since 2012 installing all different kinds of flood protection devices, ranging from doors to new flood walls along the perimeter of our system, reinforcing utility manholes and utility covers to reduce the amount of water that penetrates into our system. And we're just now about to undertake a climate vulnerability assessment where we're using future-facing climate data for the entire region that's produced by local universities, looking at several different risk categories, including coastal storm, storm surge, looking at the impacts of sea level rise and chronic tidal flooding, as well as its impacts on storm surge, extreme precipitation, which exacerbates inland flooding events, as well as temperature extremes, extreme heat and extreme cold. We anticipate that this climate vulnerability assessment will be a very important tool for us as we continue to advance our long-term capital planning through the year 2100, as well as thinking about our neighbors and the kinds of dependencies that we have, including our relationships with our electrical providers, our communications providers, our storm sewer managers, which are all dependencies that we need, relationships that our system is required to maintain in order to reduce the level of risk exposure that we have on our system. So I'd like to talk a little bit about our CDP disclosure process last year. I've been at the MTA for about a year. Our group is new, and one of my first tasks was to complete the CDP Public Authorities Disclosure. And I want to say, it's one of the most impactful things that I could have done just starting with the organization. It really gave me an opportunity to know the organization much better. We're a very large organization with 72,000 people who work in this organization, very challenging to navigate. But I would say that the CDP disclosure process really gave me an opportunity to think about the strengths of our organization from a climate planning perspective and where we needed to start to think about ways to fill in gaps in our ability to think both about greenhouse gas emissions reduction as well as climate risk mitigation. So in 2022, New York State government, our state governor, required that all state authorities participate in the 2022 Public Authorities Pilot. And so MTA, along with our other state authorities, which are far-ranging in responsibilities, were required to participate in this pilot. The MTA was the largest organization, I think, that participated in this pilot. And we hope that the process will repeat again in 2023. So some of the benefits of participating in the pilot, given that I had just started with the organization, I think that the way the questionnaire was arranged really gave me an opportunity to think about priorities as I was forming a team, thinking both about staffing and skill sets as we forge a path on better deployment of our climate sustainability goals, as well as thinking about the climate risks that we want to prioritize and those consequential for capital planning. it really gave me an opportunity to think about where the agency has progressed in recent years on emissions tracking. We do report our greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis, but we hadn't been using that information to inform capital planning or really tracking against a greenhouse gas emissions reductions goal. And so now we have both of those opportunities before us. And I think that the questionnaire really gave me an opportunity to think about the organization, to think about what elements of tracking that I wanted to prioritize as we're embarking on this process for the very first time. And then this opportunity gave me the chance to connect with my public authorities colleagues within New York State. Interestingly, we hadn't really had the opportunity to connect on climate issues, and doing the questionnaire together really gave us the opportunity to think about the challenges in approaching this. It gave me the ability to not feel defensive as I was filling this out on behalf of my organization, but instead just share where we're at and just be very honest in sharing where we're at and recognizing that there's a lot of opportunities for improvement as we're going forward. Some considerations in future public authorities questionnaires. I'd love to see a way that we could account for transit's unique greenhouse gas emissions benefits. Like I was saying at the beginning of the presentation, the unique services that we provide actually should be expanded because of their greenhouse gas emissions reductions globally. So I would just ask that we keep the big picture in mind as we look internally for greenhouse gas emissions reductions. The questionnaire really revealed to me how challenging Scope 3 emissions tracking is going to be for our organization, particularly given all the legal constraints that we have for procurement. And this is something that I'm going to continue to focus on in the coming year. There was really no way for us to think about construction projects. We're a very large construction agency. And as we think about these emissions associated with embodied carbon and how we reduce the amount of embodied carbon associated with construction projects and start using environmental product disclosures associated with concrete and steel and other construction materials, I'd like to see the Public Authorities Questionnaire give us some frameworks for thinking in that area as well. And then finally, I think it will be challenging for us as a public authority without the mandate from above to continue reporting on an annual basis, at least formally. I think we'll continue to do so informally, but it was really nice to have that push from above to catalyze the organization and my management to be responsive to this request from the state governor. So in closing, I'd like to share my email address. Definitely happy to continue the conversation, and please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Eric Wilson. So that was very much it for the Public Authorities Program and for actually an introduction to the work that CDP does as an organization across all the different actors and across all the different topics that we are facing when it comes to environmental change. And I think we still have a bit of time even for a few questions, not only to me, but maybe Maxfield, if you want to join me on stage as well for questions. The floor is open. Thank you so much. If you have.
For sure.
You talk about emissions from people living in cities. Can you tell me, sort of relatively, how much more do people in cities pollute than people not living in cities?
I think that's an excellent question, and I'm afraid I don't have the data right now. But I would assume if you have 70% of the emissions that are city-related, 30% of them are happening outside of cities.
Hello, my name is Elva. I'm from the Icelandic Environment Agency. This is the first time I get a presentation about your work, so it's very interesting to hear. And I'm still filling in the gaps of my knowledge about what it is that you do precisely. So I was wondering, when the companies or the agencies or whoever it is fills out your questionnaires and relevant information and so on, are they filling? Is the focus on the processes, or do they also have to reach certain goals or certain levels of activity, or do they have to perform at a certain level with regards to, for example, reducing emissions or so on, or is it more about just having all the processes in place and asking the relevant questions in all these different aspects that you've already mentioned?
Would you like to take that, or would you like me to? Happy to take it. So there's different aspects of the questionnaire. I think I had laid out on the screen prior that there are, of course, the aspects related to disclosure. It starts with transparency around issues like governance, risks, and opportunities. But ultimately, what we're trying to build up to is to ensure that you have all the rungs of the ladder in place to be able to start achieving environmental action, starting with, of course, the governance structures, the processes and plans, but ultimately, once that's in place, we want to see the targets and that you have a plan in place to achieve that target. One of the requirements for companies specifically, and this is being integrated from a city perspective as well, is around the Science-Based Target Initiative. CDP was a founding member along with UNGC, who is here today, I believe WRI and WWF, on the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And it was actually putting the question into the questionnaire, do you have a science-based target, which has now fueled to more than 3,000 companies around the world now setting science-based targets in line with the guidance provided by the SBTi. So that expectation, of course, is to have the infrastructure in place, but to have the correct targets that are essentially your fair share of emissions based on a 1.5 trajectory, ultimately leading to net zero, and that you have plans in place to achieve that, and that you are achieving it on an annual basis. So not only are we tracking the infrastructure and the processes you have in place, but we're actually tracking on a year-over-year basis through reporting the emissions of organization or water security information or deforestation emission, and are you tracking towards achieving the target that you've identified on a year-over-year basis. We also include verification within the questionnaire. So the numbers are verified by a third party, and that third party verification is a requirement to be able to get an A in CDP. So for example, Landsvirkjun explained how they're having their emissions verified by a third party. So part and parcel to your question, it is both the structure, the processes, as well as the targets, your plans to achieve them, and tracking your progress towards achieving those targets. Yes, please. Did I hit that right?
I was also impressed to see that you were asking about a lot of different aspects here. You're not just talking about, you mentioned biodiversity and you mentioned waste and a lot of other things as well. I was especially interested in hearing if you tackle sort of the sort of systemic changes that need to be done to be able to reach circular economy as a linking factor in all of these factors, because we are seeing, I was just learning this last week, that actually we're seeing trends that show that as we are able to decouple more, we also tend to consume more. So even if we are making responsible choices in our consumption, we also tend to consume more. So it was just interesting. If you are thinking about longevity of product use and repairability and things like that within the circular economy, that is really important to not then impact even more on forest, water, waste, all the other things that are in place there.
would you like to start out, or you would like? Well, okay, yeah, happy to as well. So CDP, we started out with just simply a climate change questionnaire about 22 years ago, and we expanded on that to include both water security and deforestation. But as part of our new 5-year strategy released about a year and a half ago, we'll be expanding to cover all aspects of planetary boundaries, essentially becoming the credible deep dive of the E of ES and G. So we've now started to introduce biodiversity. We're introducing plastics and impacts onto oceans use, but we'll be expanding to land use, circular economy, and other aspects of looking at broad-scale planetary boundaries. Specifically related to products. Part of our supply chain questionnaire, where large-scale corporate customers ask their suppliers to respond to CDP, they utilize CDP's questionnaire as a basis for not only understanding what's within their supply base, but cascading impact, does focus on product accounting. And product accounting is going to become even more credible and serious in the future. I think there's a little bit of wild, wild west aspect into that data, much like Scope 3. But having that product information is not going to only empower decision makers on what they purchase, but on how companies design the products themselves to look at issues around longevity and the different inputs that go into that. We've actually been partnering with BCG on a tool that they have developed there around product calculations and around using AI to be able to look at the full suite world and looking at technology that's coming to the sphere to help those who are manufacturing and creating and designing to make sure that they are selecting the right levers and inputs in terms of the products they create, which also empowers the end user as well to make the decisions. So this is going to get even more necessary, and why we need to have primary data, utilizing the power of AI as well to expand this. And product footprinting is key to that, ensuring a productive circular economy indeed.
Do you share your data with like government entities like statistics offices and the environmental agency? Would you share that data with it?
Absolutely. The whole point of CDP is to enable decision makers and bring the power of our data in the hand of decision makers. So I think I previously put up the slide that showed the full universe that is being fueled by environmental and social governance data, and CDP that is the deep dive of the E of ES and G, and it's underpinning not only looking at capital markets who are using it to build funds, it's being integrated into Bloomberg terminals and throughout the market ecosystem. We are working with governments who use our data. We're working with the European Union as well as now the United States. Federal government, Office of the White House has put out a federal rulemaking this year for their supply chain work that says all federal suppliers will be required to report their carbon emissions and their carbon strategies on an annual basis. One of those avenues is CDP, and to set science-based targets. Specifically within Europe, we're partnering with the government of Netherlands, Italy, and France, and now we hope after this trip, the government of Iceland as well, to put that decision-making into their hand, to endorse CDP Disclosure, to collect information from cities and companies and utilize that to look at their own government ambitions and help them build their national deterrent contributions for the for the Paris Agreement.
And to add to that, more recently, we've been trying to put all of that data in a way that's government-friendly via a tool that's called the Government Dashboard, and which aimed at being used by policymakers in a way that's easy and salient. Yeah.
Our goal is to get this data out into the collective ecosystem for use in decision-making, whether it be policymakers, whether it be cities, municipalities, and corporations.
Yes, hi. My name is Kristin from HS Orka. Just wanted to hear maybe a few words on how you see CDP going forward, developing in relation with other standards. And how are you complementing it? Are you replacing it? Or what are your goals or your vision on that?
Yeah, happy to take the question of standards and the alphabet soup that is out there on this front. But what our goal is to do is, part of our 5-year strategy is to scale the most important and relevant standards and utilizing CDP as a system to help achieve success on that. Of course, we know standards and regulations are not going to achieve 1.5 or nature positivity. So in a way, you could almost think of CDP as a taxonomy of the taxonomy that really is that collective North Star that is taking us beyond what is required from a regulatory perspective to achieve what's necessary to get our planet and ecosystems in harmony. But as part of that, we are looking to how we can integrate standards to scale and essentially help them scale. If you look back at the TCFD, or the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, the whole basis of now reporting for TCFD is that CDP is TCFD aligned. And the reason why all this data exists out within the ecosystem is because we align CDP reporting with TCFD. In 2024, we will integrate the ISSB's climate standard, and that will be that first basis of integration of how we scale standards, with the ISSB being that global baseline. But of course, we're looking towards the partnerships that we're formulating with the EU around how we can integrate the ESRS. We've already have the question within our questionnaire this year that will be coming up related to the taxonomy, but we'll be looking towards how we can integrate not only the global baseline, but other mandatory standards that are coming out, like the ESRS or the SEC in the United States, so we can help companies make sense of this. De facto, for the past 20 years, CDP has been preparing companies for mandatory reporting, and it's now arrived, specifically here in the EU. With that, I think we may be at our questions, and I think we've provided a lot of good information today. So thank you so much, Angele, and the floor is now yours. Back to Landsvirkjun.
Well, thank you for a wonderful afternoon. I really enjoyed it, as I was hoping. And I hope you all did as well, and thank you for joining, who are here, and also you that are joining us via the internet. And I would encourage everyone that's here today to get in contact with Max or Angele if you want to have more information. And at least, as Jóhanna and I said earlier, we at least have benefited a lot from the cooperation with CDP. They have been pushing, and they keep on pushing, and we just look forward to the next questionnaires to come. So thank you again, and have a great afternoon. Do you want to have some final words, Max?
I would just like to say thank you so much for your partnership, and we're looking forward to working with you to transform the norm here in Iceland.
Thank you.